Good evening, everybody. I encourage you to take a seat if you haven't done so already. Lots of nice seats here at the front. Don't be embarrassed. A very warm welcome to Rethink, especially if you haven't been to something like this before. Rethink is a session that we run about 3 times a year with our good friends from God First Church. And the aim is to investigate an issue of general interest or concern from a Christian point of view. And our topic this evening is the broken world, the whole question of suffering. I'm Richard Coombs, the rector of St Matthew's in the Minster, and Howard, who's the minister of God First Church, is going to be fielding the questions at the end. Now, we all know that our world is beautiful, but it is also deeply broken. And we see that brokenness in the headlines almost every day, don't we? Earthquakes, floods, wars, and sometimes very much closer to home in our own personal lives. And many people ask, quite understandably, if there's a God and if he's loving, how can he allow such suffering? And that is the big question that we're thinking about this evening. And to help us, I am so delighted that Sharon Dirckx, Dr. Sharon Dirckx, is with us here tonight. She's come to us from Oxford, where, amongst a number of other things, she works for the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. I am right about that? You're friends with them. You're self-employed. Thank you for correcting me. Sharon is a speaker. She's an author. She's a scientist. We've got 3 of her books on the table over there, so if you're interested in what she says tonight, you can follow up by buying one of her books and reading them. And she also has an incredibly thoughtful and compassionate way of addressing this whole question of suffering. There will be an opportunity for you to ask her questions at the end, and we're going to do that via Slido. So, Joseph, could we have the Slido slide up? If you haven't come across Slido before, you do need a mobile phone, I'm afraid, to operate this system. But if you click on that QR code or go to the Slido website, app, I don't know, something like that, and type in that number, that will get you onto the Slido poll, and you can type in a question that you would like to ask Sharon, and what Slido does is it rates the questions. So if you like a particular question, you can click it, and that will go up the poll, so that's more likely to be asked at the end. We'll put that slide up again a little bit later on so that you can have another chance to get onto it. So, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Sharon Dirckx.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. Very much enjoyed speaking when you were a rector in Burford as well. And thank you, Howard, as well, for inviting me, and for each of you for coming out on, it feels like winter's coming, doesn't it? The days are getting darker, and it's a slightly bigger deal to start coming out in the evening. So thank you for doing that this evening, particularly as we look at this question of natural disasters and why God would allow them. Now, looking around the room, I see a range of ages, and there are some of you that will remember what you were doing on Boxing Day in 2000, and let me get the year right, 4, when we were sitting in the relative comfort of our living rooms, watching one of the worst natural disasters in living history in Indonesia due to an earthquake in the Indian Ocean, one of the worst tsunamis ever to be recorded, the Indian Ocean Boxing Day tsunami, in which almost 250,000 people were killed and almost 2 million were displaced. We could also think of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, decimating many parts of the southern USA, killing almost 2,000 people and displacing 600,000 and more. We could also look at Haiti 2010 and again in 2022, although Haiti is not short of man-made problems as well. We could look at Myanmar in just earlier this year, the 28th of March. An earthquake struck Myanmar, nearly 3,600 were killed, 5,000 injured. And in this year alone, 2025 alone, there's been an earthquake in the Philippines, there have been typhoons in Vietnam. Ebola is resurfacing in the DRC. We don't hear about that too much in the news, do we? And earthquakes in Afghanistan. And it goes on and on. And of course, we're into hurricane season in the USA as well. I don't really need to lay out the sort of need for to think about why the world is the way that it is. And of course, we could also think about the impact of disease and sickness. We often, in our very seismically stable UK, we tend to encounter most natural disasters through our TV screens or social media feeds. But we've all encountered disease and sickness one way or another. And actually, we've all been caught up in the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a natural disaster that came to all of us one way or another, leading to a very bizarre few years as we look back on it. And of course, a time of great loss and trauma as well. So why do these things happen? And of course, there are no easy answers. We don't have the answers to this question. This is mysterious in many ways. Suffering is the hardest question of all, arguably. The biggest barrier to faith, if someone is going to walk away from God or refuse or just resist belief in him, very often it will be due to an experience of suffering. And this is not an academic question, it's not simply intellectual. And we've all been caught up in it. And part of a response that Christians give when they get asked about suffering is what's known as a free will defense. One of the things they say is, look, we don't understand everything, but humans have been given freedom. And sometimes they are kind to each other, other times they're cruel to each other. And that's partly why we see so much suffering in the world. And that helps us to some extent, but that doesn't help us with natural disasters. Whenever I've spoken on suffering, and that's been the main portion of what I say, my very first question back is, well, but what about natural disasters? They don't seem to be due to the freely made choices of anybody. We seem to just be caught up in these things. And so this kind of suffering requires a different kind of response. Philosophers, if you like, distinguish between moral evil and natural evil. I'm trying to advance. Where do I point it? That way? Ah, did I do that or did you do that? Okay, we'll figure it out, don't worry. So philosophers distinguish, in a way, between moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil is evil that leads to suffering because of how human beings behave. But natural evil is trying to address the question of why nature itself causes suffering. So earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, pandemics, cancers, and so on. And that's what we're looking at this evening. So where should we start with this question? Well, it is worth asking, do you mind advancing it? Thank you. The question that if God does not exist, what kind of explanations are available to us? If there is no God, how might we go about making sense of why there are disasters and diseases? And thank you. I don't know if I did that or whether you did. Never mind. Hopefully this will. So the late Christopher Hitchens a best-selling author and atheist known as one of the four horsemen of new atheism, was interviewed in 2011 on CNN about his terminal cancer diagnosis. And he was asked whether, despite his atheism, he'd been tempted to ask the question, why me? And he responded with this. He said, you can't avoid the question, however stoic you are, you can only bat it away as a silly one. Millions of people die every day. Everyone's got to go sometime. And actually, that's a very courageous response, but it's a very bleak response, given that he died later that year, and yet it is entirely consistent with his atheism. Because if there is no God, then there are no disasters as such. There are biological and geophysical events in the world. But this is essentially just the way the world is. This is just how it rolls. Earthquakes, tsunamis, and hurricanes are simply the laws of nature doing what they do. Some people were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's the luck of the draw. And equally, pandemics and genetic diseases are accidents of nature. By chance alone, it's going to go wrong sometimes. If you think about the billions of DNA base pairs in one human body and then the nearly 8 billion people on Earth, chance alone could say, look, occasionally that amazing mechanism is going to make mistakes. But there's nothing right or wrong about it. It's just the way the world is. And of course, many would look to scientific explanations as well, and this is not wrong either, saying that the world that we have is simply the flip side of living on a planet that can sustain life. You see, some of the mechanisms involved in natural disasters play a vital role in sustaining life. So, tectonic plate movement enables nutrients from the ocean beds to be recycled back to the surface. Volcanic eruptions release pressure and vital minerals into the biosphere. And that's partly why the soil, volcanic soil, is so fertile. It's so rich in minerals. You can grow amazing fruit and vegetables in them. And that's why people live really near volcanoes. My book, Broken Planet, in fact, both of my books on suffering combine stories with argument. And in Broken Planet, there's a story about a community that live inside the crater of a live volcano. And no one has ever died in a volcanic eruption. I'll say more about that later, if you like. I remember watching a cookery program that was talking about a restaurant that was nestled in an extinct volcanic crater. And again, the soil meant that they could grow these extraordinary vegetables for use in their restaurant. And so there's something very life-giving about some of the mechanisms involved in natural disasters, in some kinds of natural disasters. They also create great beauty. The mountain ranges that we climb up in the summer and ski down in the winter are the same, caused by the same mechanisms as the tectonic plate movement that cause earthquakes and tsunamis. Similarly, the Hawaiian Islands, the Azores, and many other island formations are volcanic. And so we see that this is not as straightforward as we might think. And even viruses are essential for life. There are 100 million viral types floating around in the air right now. Only 1% are harmful to people. They play a vital role in sustaining life, such that if we were to get rid of all viruses overnight, we'd all die. As Tony Goldberg, an epidemiologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, said, if all viruses suddenly disappeared, the world would be a wonderful place for about a day and a half, and then we'd all die, and that's the bottom line. All the essential things they do in the world far outweigh the bad things. Viruses are key to ecosystems. They prevent certain bacterial populations overgrowing and becoming too dominant. It helps keep things in balance. That helps, for example, to keep the amount of plankton on the ocean beds in the right proportions. That helps to keep oxygen at the right levels in the atmosphere. And so you begin to see that these tiny things that have this way of causing havoc every once in a while on Earth as well, also have a life-giving role. But either way, these scientific explanations, in the absence of God, someone might say this is just the way the world is. These things are the way that they are. But if this is just the way the world is, then here's a question. Why do we experience them as disasters? Why don't we just call them natural events instead of natural disasters? It's as though, the argument that this is just the way the world is not enough. It's not enough to help us make sense of our response, our reaction to these things. When we see people caught up in them and suffering and dying, it's not enough to simply say this is just the way it is. We experience anger and frustration and grief. You see, to call something a disaster is actually to make a moral judgment about the world that we live in. And it says that there is something wrong with the world. And it expresses a longing that things ought to be better than the way that they actually are. To call something a disaster is to imply that something is wrong. Well, the Christian faith makes sense of that. It says your intuitive sense that there is something wrong is absolutely right. Because at the heart of the Christian faith is the belief that God, who is good and sets the ultimate standard of goodness, has created a beautiful world, but somehow that world has gone wrong, giving rise to evil. And so the instinct that we have actually makes sense if God exists. Actually, it makes more sense if God exists, because the Christian faith says a good God has created a beautiful world, but that world has gone wrong. We live, in fact, on a broken planet. So at its core, ironically, although it feels like it should point away from God's existence, and we think, why on earth would God create a world like this? The very fact that we feel that, we sense a wrongness, that makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. Because if he doesn't exist, who do we get angry to? What are we angry about? What is the wrongness in the world if it's just a biological and geophysical world of mechanisms? Now, another question we could ask is, well, if God exists, why couldn't he have made a better world than this one? This is a slightly different question, and our questions come in different forms. Now, Britain is well known for its variable weather. We take umbrellas everywhere. I have been known to take an umbrella to the desert, just in case it rains, just in case, you just never know. And of course, the weather surely is a very popular topic of conversation. Those of you that are not from the UK are probably just warming up to this, pardon the pun. But, we love to talk about the weather because there's so much to talk about. Whether the conditions are too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, too foggy, too sunny, too cloudy, too windy, whatever it might be. There's a lot to talk about in the British weather. And yet, when we consider the planets around us, the weather on Earth seems pretty tepid, actually. And when we look at the planets around us, it's a marvel that life even exists at all. If we were to look at Venus, 80% of the surface of Venus is volcanic. It is hostile to life. You cannot, there is no life on Venus. She says, blanket statement. Just watch the headlines in a few weeks. I do think I'm all right. That's good. If we go the other way to Jupiter, we can see from Earth the eye of Jupiter, very famous. This is a storm the size of 2 Earths put together, double the strength of any hurricane you would find on Earth. It's been going on for about 400 years, with temperatures of around minus 163 Celsius, calling for a bit of a redefinition of the term extreme weather. You see, when we look at the planets around us, they are hostile to life. And yet somehow on Earth, even though we have these cataclysms, it seems to be that they are boundaried such that life is still possible. And so before we delve into these disasters, it's helpful to zoom out first and appreciate the marvel that it is to even for there to be life at all. So I want to just highlight a couple of ways that I found it to be helpful to think about this. And what I'm going to talk about from here on in the talk is 3 different perspectives: natural factors, human factors, and then spiritual factors later on. And these are not mutually exclusive. It's not pick your option. I think that together they all help us think about this. So the first thing that I say is, look, that the problem isn't so much with nature, but with how people interact with nature. You see, nature's got its mechanisms, and they are necessary to sustain life. But the problem isn't with the mechanisms as such, it's the way that human beings interact with those mechanisms and with nature itself. You see, when nobody is hurt by a natural disaster, it doesn't seem quite so serious or so bad. We hear all the time of like volcanic fissures opening up in Iceland. You know, what was like at one point just a field, essentially a couple of weeks later is spewing lava, and tourists come and try and get too close to this. But there's something quite awesome, awe-inspiring about the majesty of nature, of some of the forms of mechanism that we're talking about. They're kind of awe-inspiring. There's something, when there are no casualties, when nobody is hurt, there's something very striking about the rawness of nature. There are even possible glimpses that the Bible even talks about this. In Psalm 97, it talks about how the mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth. And God in Psalm 104 is described as someone who looks at the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. Are these references to earthquakes and volcanoes? And if so, they're not being referred to in a negative way. They're being referred to in a positive way, pointing to the majesty of God and the way that he relates to his creation. And so one perspective is to say the problem isn't so much with nature, it's with how people interact with nature. And the problem is that people have become vulnerable to natural disasters, and we've made each other vulnerable. So human factors have made human beings vulnerable to natural disasters. And so this view would really say there's no such thing as a 100% natural disaster. Every tragedy is always a combination of human factors and natural factors combined. So what might some of those human factors be? Well, I think one of the biggest ones is the impact of poverty. Some people are more vulnerable than others to natural disasters, and the major thing that determines that is levels of poverty. If you compare the number of deaths in a natural disaster in a low-income country with the same kind of disaster in a high-income country, you will see that the number that suffer and die in the low-income country is several orders of magnitude greater. Why? Because of poverty. We could compare two very similar strength earthquakes, California 1989 and Haiti 2010. In California, 59 people died, and that's partly because they were repairing or rebuilding a motorway at the time. In Haiti 2010, they don't actually know the exact Numbers, it's somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000. Have a story in Broken Planet from Haiti, 2010, that the magnitude of suffering was just, we can't imagine. Same strength of earthquake, completely different level of suffering. And of course, every person, whether they're in California or Haiti, that died matters. But my point here is that poverty undoubtedly increases the suffering and the numbers that die. We saw this in Turkey, in the Turkey-Syria earthquake 2 years ago as well. Even luxury apartment blocks actually pancaked in that earthquake. Why? Because they were not built within building regulations. And we saw this in Haiti 2010, luxury hotels pancaked as well. People that, in Japan, the hotel would have swayed, they would have been able to get out, but not in these cases. And that is a human factor increasing the suffering in a natural disaster. We could also talk about climate change. I mean, where I speak about this impacts how this goes, but I think in this kind of context, we're probably fairly agreed that the scientific community is saying that, global temperatures on Earth have notably increased and are close to an irreversible tipping point. And this has caused polar ice caps to melt, which has increased flooding and landslides, and that's the most devastating kind of natural disaster, flooding. Very unremarkable, but actually the most devastating over the long term. Those changes in temperature have also increased, changed local weather patterns, which has increased the frequency and severity of hurricanes. That's why we're seeing a lot more in the US and in the Bay of Bengal. And it's also causing wildfires to burn hotter and longer. We're hearing about a lot more wildfires, aren't we? We just had California over the summer, possibly a bit in Australia. Some stories from Australia in 2020 in Broken Planet as well. And the problem with a really, really overheated wildfire is that it incinerates. It means that new life can't grow after the fire has swept through. Whereas a cooler wildfire has a regenerative effect, again, this kind of regeneration. And again, the human role in climate change it doesn't really need spelling out, does it? Our use of fossil fuels releasing CO2, which has caused temperatures to go up. And that's had an impact on some kinds of natural disaster. So this first point is to say there's no such thing as a purely 100% natural disaster. Every disaster, if you dig beneath the surface, you will see that yes, nature is doing its thing, but there are also human factors playing into the suffering. But another perspective, the other perspective that I want to bring in here is spiritual factors. And at this point, we simply say, that's all well and good and necessary to know about. But are these kinds of explanations on their own enough? Plate tectonics, poverty, climate change, they're all vital. But are they enough to make sense of every kind of natural disaster that we see on Earth? You see, it seems like there are some kinds of disaster that they have no human factor and they have no life-giving effect. They just seem to be destructive. Maybe we see this most clearly in the area of disease and sickness. Why are there childhood genetic diseases? It's very hard to find human factors. Why do our bodies succumb to disease? Why, even if we live a healthy lifestyle, have a healthy diet, why do some people still die young? Why do some still succumb to illness? And why are we all, some are further along than others, on a trajectory towards decay and death? What is it that's been woven into the way that the world is, such that this is the case? Couldn't God have made a different kind of world, that these things didn't happen at all? And it's at this point that I feel like when I'm talking to people and when I'm just thinking about it, a deeper level of explanation is also needed to sit alongside everything that's been said already. It seems like there's a brokenness that's woven into the very physical world itself, into our very biology, and of course into the human heart as well. So this view is saying that nature is also broken, and that this brokenness has a spiritual cause. Somehow spiritual brokenness has led to brokenness in nature and biology. And it isn't just that God exists. We get ourselves really tied up in knots if we try and answer the question of suffering and we only talk about God and we don't talk about evil and where that actually comes from and the impact that actually has. You see, this view is actually saying, look, there are forces of evil that are somehow interwoven with the forces of nature. And it happened so far back that it just seems to us like that's always the way that it's been. All of our scientific records reflect that. But what if that brokenness was, that took place far before there were even any scientists or possibility of any records? This view is saying that there's an underlying cause that isn't immediately obvious, but that does account for the brokenness. And we see this being talked about in the New Testament, and the Apostle Paul, writing his letter to the church in Rome, describes the natural world as being in a state of frustration and transition. He says, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. These are words that indicate that the natural order is not at peace with itself. It is frustrated and writhing and groaning, similar to a woman in labor. And so this second view says that spiritual brokenness has led to brokenness in nature and biology. But this is a really important part, not in a personal, directed way, not in a, here, you have this, in a way that just has affected all of us. A little bit like if you were to drop a drop of ink into a glass of water, the ink signifying the brokenness. It diffuses through the whole glass so that anyone taking a sip would sample both the water and the ink. There's a brokenness that affects all of us, that we're all caught up in. We could talk about how nature is broken. I probably won't spend too much time on this in the interests of time, but there are two particular angles. Perhaps the more traditional angle is what we might call the human fall view, which links the spiritual brokenness to a human fall, to the choices of Adam and Eve that somehow dragged along into their rebellion, their very biology and the natural world. We see hints of this in Genesis when the serpent, who is the one that tempts them, God says to the woman that he will make her pains in childbirth greatly increase after this decision, and that to the man that the ground itself will be subject to a curse with an effect on the physical world. The challenge of this view, if you take a view that the Earth and the universe is very old, is how to make sense of the geological record that says that there were earthquakes and volcanoes long before humans ever existed. It also has to wrestle with the seemingly unfairness of some human decision that somehow has dragged along with it the rest of the created order. So there's lots to wrestle with, as there is with every view. Another view, again, not mutually exclusive, that can sit alongside that is what's known as the pre-human fall view, which says, look, it's possible that nature became broken before people did. And the reason that's possible is because in Genesis, the serpent is simply in the garden already. The author of Genesis says nothing about how the serpent got there, how long he'd been there, what he'd been up to all that time. And just as the origins of evil are tied to the fall of an angelic being created good that rebelled and fell and became corrupted, that's what the Bible hints at as the origins of Satan. This view simply says, did that have any impact on the natural world, given that the serpent was already there in the biblical narrative? So that would be known as the pre-human fall view. But of course, the challenge of that view is they have to wrestle with how God would allow these forces to be at work in his creative process, and a process that is deemed good in the Genesis accounts. Every view has its challenges and things to wrestle with. But either way, both of these views are saying, look, the brokenness in nature has a spiritual root as well. And that spiritual root is not personal, it is general. It affects all of us. So there are natural factors, there are human factors, and there are spiritual factors. Now, towards the end of the talk, I want to just change gear a bit and ask a different kind of question. What kind of God would allow natural disasters and diseases? Because very often we wrestle with the character of God. If he exists, what is he like? Why has he allowed this kind of world? In one of my stories in Broken Planet is a story of a doctor that went into the Boxing Day tsunami about a week after it had happened. They were delivering aid and helping children's health. They flew into Banda Aceh, which was the epicenter of the tsunami, took a helicopter ride down the coastline in Indonesia. You could only see the footprint of these villages left. The actual buildings were 3 miles inland. One village that he was at had 270 residents, but after the tsunami there were only 70. Every single family had lost someone. He talked about a mother who had lost her husband and all of her children, and a boy who had lost his parents and all of his siblings. And she said to the boy in this clinic, "You're my son now, I'll take you in as my own." This extraordinary tragedy, and yet somehow beauty in the midst of it. But what they noticed was that everybody was in a state of grief and shock. Everybody needed somebody to talk to. Everybody needed to process, but nobody could process anyone else's trauma because they were also traumatized. What do you do in that circumstance? And this doctor had brought in a team of translators, and they were primarily supposed to be there to translate medically. But what they ended up doing was sitting and listening to these people that needed just somebody to be with them in their trauma. And it reminded me that this tells us something about the kind of God that Christians believe in. You see, Christians believe in a God who has not left us alone in our suffering. He didn't just send us instructions on how to cope with the things that life throws at us, disaster, disease, pandemic, whatever it is. He actually came down to be with us, not just calling out from a distance, but actually coming alongside This is what the Christian faith speaks about, a God who has come to be with us, and a God who invites us to bring our suffering to him, who comes alongside, who actually has the weight to carry everything, despite all the other suffering going on around us. Secondly, what kind of God? A God who continues to intervene today. The very basis of humanitarian aid is the incarnation. Actually, it finds its roots in the Judeo-Christian faith that believes, yes, that God has come from heaven to earth, out of eternity, into human history, to come alongside us. And suffering is not punishment. And Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So radical in the ancient world. That's what led to the first hospitals being established, these houses of hospitality set up by these mad Galileans that said, yeah, let's look after people who are poorly. If there was a pandemic in the ancient world, you head for the hills. If you can afford it, you get out of town. It was the Christians that stayed and gave hospitality to the poor, precisely on their belief of love your neighbor as yourself. You are not being punished. This is not divine punishment. And God has come to be with us. That is the basis of humanitarian aid. And God is intervening all the time through the hands and feet of people, whether they believe in him or not. They are modeling the intervention of God indirectly through medical professionals, bringing treatment, doctors, nurses, through counselors, social workers, scientists developing anesthetics, vaccinations, antibiotics, engineers developing tsunami detection devices so that we can anticipate these things better. And the list goes on. All of these people, all of those professions and more are the hands and feet of God, a God who intervenes and who continues to intervene in the world. And of course, what kind of God? Well, a God who knows also what it is to suffer. In coming alongside us, Jesus looked hurting people in the eye, did something about their suffering, and also went on to suffer like us and for us. I don't know about you, but we have so much access to brokenness today through social media, through news channels, and so on. We can get compassion fatigue. We can become overwhelmed by our own struggles. If only there was somebody capable of bearing all of it, of carrying all of it. If only there was someone that could bear it all on our behalf, so that the weight of evil, the weight of living in such a messed up world, could be lifted off of us. Well, the Christian faith says there is. There is one. There is one person who never contributed to the problem of evil on this earth, and for that reason is able to carry it on our behalf. Jesus, the pure, unblemished one who said, did, and thought no evil ever, has somehow taken the weight of evil into himself, like darts to a dartboard. He has absorbed it into himself, so that evil need not have the last word in our lives, in whatever form it has come. And it has come to everyone, one way or another. But somehow through his suffering and death, and there's so much mystery here, there's so much, like, how is this? How did this happen? But he says if we trust him, if we follow him, we are offered new life and hope and healing. Hundreds of years before Jesus walked the earth, Isaiah the prophet described him. And he described his death as well, and he described it as him as being pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And in this day of self-harm and all of the things that we do to ourselves, it says this: by his wounds we are healed. I wonder what your wounds are. Some of us have gone through life carrying many wounds. There's the offer of healing. If you haven't known that, that stands today. By his wounds, you can be healed. That is open to everyone and anyone. The extraordinary thing is that at the moment of Jesus' death and his resurrection 2 days later, both of these events were accompanied by earthquakes. Both of them. Now, what is the significance of this? We don't know. But at the very least, perhaps it's saying this was no ordinary person and this was no ordinary death. His death literally had an earth-shattering impact. And it opened up a new era where anyone and everyone can freely come to God and know forgiveness and healing and help in the disasters and diseases that you face. There's so much we don't understand. God doesn't always give us answers, but he offers us himself every time. And I have never known him to fail me. What about you? And finally, and very briefly, a God who isn't finished. If we were just to finish before this and try and make sense of the world without making the point that God is not done doing what he's doing in this universe, it would be incomplete. Because God is only part way through what he's doing. One of the chapters in Why, my first book on suffering, asks the question, how do you fix a broken story? You know, some of our stories are so broken, it feels like there's no way to fix them. Well, if the Christian faith is true, you fix a broken story by embedding it in a much bigger story in which good wins, in which evil and the suffering it causes loses, in which there will be justice, even if there's not been justice here on earth. And it says that God will do something very extraordinary. He will wipe every tear from our eyes. And there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Evil has been defeated on that first Easter, but it hasn't yet been removed. But one day it will be removed. And that will be the day when things will make a lot more sense than they do today. I think I'm going to finish there. And we're going to take a break, small break. Yeah, I'll have to. Thank you.
It really scratched my geography degree itch. Thank you so much. But just so, such a beautifully rounded talk, and I'm sure it raised lots of questions. So what we'd love to do is to put the QR code back up and give you a chance to think about questions. The ex-school teacher in me, you're getting a bit of my CV, but the ex-school teacher in me says often if you turn and chat to the person next to you and like what resonated or what you found interesting, that might generate a question. So what we're going to do is going to give you 5-10 minutes, maybe, probably a little bit less, maybe a bit more, see how you go, and give you a chance to kind of think about how you're responding to this, and any questions you've got to raise. I think you can vote on other people's questions, I like their questions, or shape some of your own, and so we'll do that, and then I'll just try and take questions from the poll, and we'll do that. So we'll just give you 5 minutes or so just to generate your questions, give us a chance to have a look at them, and then I'll jump back up and we'll do that. Is that okay? So please do jump on that code. You can see some of the questions already.